Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about Devil House by Darnielle. I picked this up some time ago. I think I got it in the horror section in a bookshop, and I've heard mixed things about it based on that, I think. I think people went into this expecting it to be a horror novel, and it really isn't. And that's not the author's fault, that's the fault of the people in the bookshops who put it in the wrong place. But this is a book about a true crime writer. He has written a few books and is currently working on a book about murders that took place in the so-called Devil House. So he decides to purchase the house and live there and renovate it to make it look how it looked when the crime was committed, to try and immerse himself in this crime and write the definitive book on this crime. Throughout the story, we learn about that crime. We also learn about a previous crime that he wrote about, and just generally explore his kind of method for how he writes about these crimes. And also we start seeing that he's questioning why he's there and what exactly it is he's doing. I found this to be a really, really fascinating book. I think if you liked Penance by Eliza Clark, I'd recommend this book to you. Although I think actually this came before Penance, so I wonder if Eliza Clark was inspired a little bit by this. What I loved about it was that it didn't just focus on one of these crimes. We open up with the Devil House and with Gage, who's the true crime writer, telling us that he's figured out what's happened, but then he doesn't tell us. He jumps to another crime that he wrote about before, and he speaks directly to the woman who committed this crime. And then later on he returns to that crime and he talks directly to the mother of one of the victims from that crime. Then he comes back to Devil House, and it's really interesting how he jumps around and how he slowly reveals the story. And then the story itself, the truth about the crime, isn't revealed until the last section of the book, which isn't even from Gage's point of view. Another character is introduced to tell us what actually happened on that day in the 1980s. I loved this. I thought it was so compelling. I loved that it jumped around the way it did. I loved that Gage is kind of this unreliable narrator, and the most unreliable narrator. It made me think about how you can't trust a documentary, you can't trust a true crime novel or film. You just can't, because they have no obligation to tell the truth. They just have an obligation to tell you a good story. And I think people have really weird ideas about true crime. They have really kind of exploitative and unhealthy views about true crime. And I think a book like this, a book like Penance by Eliza Clark as well, but I think this is better than Penance. A book like this is really, really important. We get to see what goes into how these people spin a narrative about something that really happened. You know, people die and then someone else comes along decades later and tells you a fun story about it. This deals also with things like the Satanic Panic in the 70s and 80s and how that affected the way that the general public responded to certain crimes being committed, and how people were kind of ignored or dismissed. The things they were going through in life weren't taken into account at all, because there was this so-called satanic aspect to the crime, that was where all the focus was. He's not only writing about the exploitative nature of true crime, but he's also writing about who becomes a victim of these things and these narratives. You know, he's talking about poverty and homelessness and the difficulties that some people face that are real and do lead to bad things happening, but are completely ignored in favour of just telling a really good story and scaring people or upsetting people or in some way entertaining people. And I think this is a really good kind of antidote if you ever feel uncomfortable about, you know, the popularity of true crime and the way that people kind of sensationalise these things. I really liked Devil House. I'm so glad that I read it. I'm so glad that I picked it up. I completely understand if someone was disappointed that they thought it was going to be a horror novel and it's not. It is horrific, but it's not a horror novel. So yeah, that's Devil House by Darnielle. I really, really recommend it. I'm so glad that I read it. Probably my favourite book that I've read this year so far. Thanks for watching.